Have you ever wondered where medicines come from? Well, the pharmaceutical industry first appeared in ancient Egypt. We found papyrus scrolls bearing the names of medicines, and at around the same time, some South American tribes were discovering that certain plants had hallucinogenic properties. Also around the same time, we discovered for the first time opium in poppies. The industry then appeared in Greece, and physicians, of course, still swear allegiance to the Hippocratic Oath even today. The first drugstores appeared in Baghdad in the Middle East around AD 750. But the modern pharmaceutical industry really appeared in the late 19th century in the Upper Rhine region and around the same time in the USA. Many drugs at that time were derived purely by accident, by discovering that certain antiseptics and dyestuffs and baking powders had pharmacological activity. And these accidental discoveries led to the introduction of a huge number of drugs which became household brand names, such as aspirin. These small molecule chemical medicines contain an active pharmaceutical ingredient which is known as the generic substance. For example, in aspirin this is known as acetyl salicylic acid. And when the original branded medicine eventually reaches the end of its patent life, generic copies become available. And I'll explain the importance of this later in the course. There were then a series of really important discoveries. Insulin was discovered around 1920. Around in the same decade, Sir Alexander Fleming discovered penicillin. The 1960s saw the introduction of the contraceptive pill. But then towards the end of that decade, a drug called thalidomide caused serious problems. Thalidomide was a sleeping tablet prescribed to pregnant women, which in animals appeared to be perfectly safe. But sadly in humans, a whole generation of children were born with congenital defects. That gave rise to a realization that sometimes animal models are not always a reliable indicator of safety in human beings. And so the Declaration of Helsinki was convened, which eventually, many years later, became the Good Clinical Practice Agreement, which has improved the safety of patients and healthy volunteers in clinical studies ever since. The 1970s saw the emergence of the blockbuster, which is a drug achieving more than $1 billion per year in sales turnover. In those days, most blockbusters were for the management of chronic diseases like asthma or high blood pressure. The blockbuster model was then based on fairly high volume, fairly low value pricing. Nowadays, blockbuster status is more likely to be the result of a lower volume but higher cost medicines. The 1980s saw the rapid expansion of biotechnology and biologics. I mentioned aspirin earlier as an example of a small molecule chemical drug, but larger molecule biologic drugs are derived from living processes. And these designer drugs are created to deliver very specific outcomes. I'll talk more about biologics later in the course. Biotechnology or biopharmaceuticals really is the future of our industry. In the 1990s, we saw the beginning of a whole raft of mergers and acquisitions where many pharma companies became huge. Small biotech companies were acquired by large pharma companies who needed to fill the gaps in their pipeline. And those small biotech companies then became able to commercialize their products. As we entered this decade, we saw many of the brand name blockbuster drugs which were patented in the 1980s reach the end of their patent protection. This saw prescriptions for those conditions being filled instead by generics rather than by the original brands. And this resulted in what we refer to as the patent cliff. In this current decade, we're now seeing lots of strategic collaborations and open innovation, which effectively just means sharing of research, of data and resources. We're experiencing incredible technological achievements within the areas of rare diseases and cancers and immunotherapy. And the whole landscape is changing dramatically every day.